Well, a very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and a warm welcome to today's session, which is a focus on the UK property outlook for 2025 and what we should be thinking about in terms of not only navigating the UK legislation, which will impact either current landlords or future landlords, but also looking at the market trends which we're seeing at the moment. Next couple of slides is really a word of warning. So quite clearly, this is high-level information which we're portraying this afternoon. If indeed you are thinking about investing in property or indeed anything else, please do take some advice relevant to your own circumstances before either taking action or failing to take action. So I'm delighted. My name's Tony Smith. I'm Head of Tax Technical and Advice Delivery for Asia and the Middle East for St James's Place. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Elliot and Christian from the RPA Group. We'll be talking you through the bulk of today's presentation, and they will be talking to you about the various considerations in terms of entering the UK property market, or if you are an existing landlord, what you may need to look out for. Before we get to that, though, just a little bit from me about who we are at St James's Place. So we're the UK's largest wealth management company, founded in 1991. But not only do we have offices in the UK, we now have authorised and licensed advisors in Hong Kong, Singapore, and Dubai. So we're ideally placed to deal with international mobile clients, or indeed people who have assets across multiple jurisdictions. What we aim to do is tailor our advice specific to your circumstances to ensure that we offer a bespoke solution. And those bespoke solutions could incorporate any of the things you see on the screen in front of you at the moment. So, for example, there's been massive legislation changes in the UK in terms of tax legislation from an inheritance tax, income tax, and indeed capital gains tax perspective over recent years, particularly so in the autumn budget last year, and which measures came into force from the 6th of April this year. So no matter where you find yourself, if you're a UK expat and you're thinking of relocating elsewhere, repatriating to the UK, you've got concerns about how you're going to manage your existing wealth or pass it down through the next generations, how to drive tax efficiencies, or really, and this is what we're talking about a lot at the moment, if you have UK pensions or QROPs and the impact of the legislation changes around those particular topics, then we can help. So please do get in contact with us. But my job today is also to tell you a little bit about some of the UK property considerations before handing over to my colleagues Christian and Elliot. So what are those considerations? Well, firstly, if you are looking to purchase a property in the UK, there are options around how you're going to purchase that property in the first place. Do you go down the personal ownership route, or do you go for the corporate structure? A lot of our clients historically have gone for the corporate structure because where there's mortgage lending involved, they're able to offset the mortgage interest completely against corporation tax, whereby as individual ownership, you're restricted on how you can do that. Clearly, you need to review your existing mortgages. Mortgages are always subject to change. Interest rates changes. There's a whole host of providers out there that have different products, and so you're going to need to consider which one's best for you. I don't think we really need to dwell on that terribly much. One of the big things, though, is what do you actually want or need out of an investment? How's that going to tie into your future goals and your future objectives? Are you aiming for capital growth? Are you aiming to generate an income? How does that UK property fit within your portfolio from a diversification and risk perspective? That's all something that needs to be assessed. And lastly, of course, while tax shouldn't drive your decision on an investment, you do need to be aware of it up front when going in. And we've just highlighted 4 things up front to start off with. So clearly there's an entry cost to UK property. You're going to face a stamp duty land tax charge. And whether you're buying in England, Northern Ireland, Wales or Scotland, the same principle will apply, albeit there's slightly different rates and tiers in the 2 devolved administrations. But you're going to have to account for standard rates of stamp duty land tax. If it's your second or subsequent purchase, you're also going to have to think about whether the surcharge applies in your circumstances. That would increase your entry cost. And lastly, as a non-UK resident, there's a further surcharge if you're buying a property in either England or Northern Ireland. So that's one of the considerations. Secondly, if you're owning a property and you decide to rent it out, you will have to account for UK income tax on the rental income. Obviously, there are various things you can offset against that rental income, but at the end of the day, any income above your personal allowances in the UK will be subject to UK tax, and you will have to report and potentially pay that liability. You can also ensure that you've registered for the non-resident landlord scheme, which simply means that you receive that income gross without any tax deduction from your agent, but you will still have to account for it at year end. In terms of selling an existing property or in terms of planning an exit strategy for a property you're about to purchase, obviously capital gains tax is going to be a consideration, and that's equally going to apply whether you sell or indeed gift the property at some later date. And just to end on a high note, and what happens in the event of death, we also need to consider inheritance tax. No matter who you are or where you are, UK inheritance tax will apply if you own a UK property. And it will apply if your total UK taxable estate is above a certain threshold. If that property does not pass to your spouse or civil partner, then you are going to have to account for UK inheritance tax. Property can be quite tricky to deal with from an inheritance tax perspective, but there are some very simple measures you can take to ensure your beneficiaries get the full value of your estate, simply by effecting an insurance policy, for example. So for all the detailed considerations and the market trends we're experiencing at the moment, please allow me to introduce the RPA Group, and I'll now pass over to Christian and Elliot. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Tony. Thanks for sort of giving us the initial overview when it comes to the tax side of things and St James's Place. So we are Christian and I are both team members in the RPA Group based in the Middle East in Dubai. Essentially, what we do is we are experts in advising people living overseas purchasing UK investment properties. We've been working with St James's Place now as one of their preferred partners for the last 2 years or so, and have very much enjoyed the new relationship and helping St James's Place's clients and advising them on all things when it comes to purchasing property in the UK, whether that be obviously from using experts like Tony when it comes to tax, or looking at the right mortgage options, through to us having the lettings and management team based in the UK, and then obviously our own advice here. When we're looking at the pure investments, whether it be just the cash flow, what your ROIs are going to be, and everything else along those lines. So, as mentioned, we are based here in the Middle East. We do have offices in the UK, and also in Africa, Turkey, and headquartered in UAE. And we do have some exposure also to the Far East in Hong Kong. Now, I think one of the sort of key reasons why we sort of partnered with St James's Place and what they liked about us as a business is our track record and the feedback that we get from our clients when we're working with them, and giving ultimately, our main objective, which very much falls in line with St James's Place's main objective, is giving the right advice. So we spend a lot of time working on due diligence and ensuring that we're partnering with the right developers in the UK that offer the right investment opportunities, ensuring that properties are in a location where we feel there's going to be strong capital growth, that there is a strong rental demand, that we're working with the right developer, so they're well funded, they have a good track record, the build quality is to something that we find attractive, and we think that will also be attractive to the market. We don't necessarily operate in any particular market per se, but I would say from a price perspective, our core market is anything between in the UK, anything from 300 to 500,000 pounds in terms of a purchase price. And what that means is we don't necessarily have prime central London trophy homes, because we don't necessarily think that gives the complete investment, but also we don't really operate in the sort of lower end of the market, looking at things like student accommodation or anything like that. It's very much catered for finding the right properties in the right location that you should look at as a sort of a 10 to 15 year hold, and then will give you a very attractive return. Just looking forward to the sort of market in the UK over the next sort of 5 years or so, and I'm sure many of you on this where we are today. We've sort of been keeping a keen eye on how house prices are going and seeing what's been happening. Obviously, we've come out of a time of a relatively high inflationary market in the UK. So interest rates have also been higher. With the combination of the inflation coming under control, inflation rates coming under control, and the mortgage rates sort of slowly coming down to sort of slightly lower levels, we're just about to enter a market where we expect to see an uptick in sort of values over the next 5 years. Looking at sort of the northwest, cities like Manchester, for instance, where you're going to see almost up to a 30% growth over the next 5 years. West Midlands, similar sort of in mid-20s, 26%, and London around 21%. So, they are pretty in strong price growth, capital appreciation, the figures in the UK over the next sort of 4 or 5 years, which is, for a market in the UK where we see a nice steady income, a nice steady growth over sort of a period of time, rather than seeing big peaks and troughs, it's certainly meaning a lot of buyers and a lot of investors at the moment are seeing now is a good time to enter the market, to enjoy that growth over the sort of short term, and then see where we are after the 5 years after that. And with all of that, we're still seeing rental growth with a very, very positive outlook over the next 5 years, which will ultimately see sort of your yields improve over that time. The fundamental sort of reasoning, if you like, behind that, I've sort of mentioned things like high inflation and interest rates and that sort of dropping, but they obviously change relatively regularly. The key fundamental to the UK market is the undersupply property. So what we are continuing to see that chronic undersupply property, and that continues to prop up the market and makes that a market that is interesting to invest in and look at real estate. And if we just look at the sort of UK real estate, sorry, just next slide, please. We look at UK real estate as a cross sector. Right at the top, the best returns and sort of an outlook over the next 5 years from both a capital value growth and an income return is residential buy-to-let property, in particular in the northwest in this instance. But this report by Savills shows all different sectors of real estate, and UK residential real estate continues to be the top performer. Reasons for that obviously are a key reason for that is that undersupply. And then if you're purchasing the right properties in the right locations, you're going to start seeing some pretty significant returns over a 5, 10, 15-year period. Okay, so that was just a bit of a sort of brief overview, really, of the UK market and where we're at the moment. There is obviously a lot more detail you can go into and that sort of things, but the main headline of today was to discuss the Renters' Right Bill. As I mentioned, we are specialists in UK property, and so we like to be able to hold conversations in all different aspects of the market. And Christian, my colleague here, will very happily now talk you through the Renters' Rights Bill and why I'm sure a lot of you have sort of dialed in to understand what's going on and how it's all going to work. Over to you, Christian.
Thanks, Elliot. And really, it's a good segue as an introduction. The Renters' Rights Bill is probably for lack of a better expression, the meat and potatoes of what we really wanted to get into today, on the basis that it has been around the Houses of Parliament and potential legislation for really an awful long time at this point. It was previously proposed by the Conservative government, didn't make it through within that parliamentary session, and then the Labour government now have picked it up and changed some of it, added to some of it, and kept sort of generally the bulk of it the same, with a strong caveat in that we are still waiting for the finalised version. But as I say, as of today, it is due for its third reading, which should mean that it's implemented this summer. So it's coming fast. And if you are a landlord at the moment with a portfolio, whether that be one property or a couple of properties, it's very important to be even just familiar with it, because it is quite a significant change to how letting property out and how you manage those properties as a landlord will come about, and probably the most significant change really since the introduction of the Housing Act in the 1980s, which has been built on and expanded upon for this very specific section of the market. There's some sort of all sorts of levels of detail that we could go into. What we've tried to do today, which you may well be sort of pleased to hear, is not get into the line by line legislation, where in fairness we are still waiting for some details to be finalized there and sort of see how that really sort of comes out in practice. What we've tried to do is just give a good overview on what the main sections of the legislation will be, how that might affect you, and how it may well affect how you manage your properties moving forward, and whether there is anything that you need to be looking at in the shorter term to make sure that you're sort of ready for what sort of comes through with this. And I would just sort of add one thing to that, in that there's a lot of chatter around this being sort of quite a negative thing. I actually sort of personally feel in some ways that there are some pros and cons to this. And some very good pros in the sense that it formalizes quite a lot of the processes that are currently already in place, that on the face of it maybe appear slightly daunting, but the reality I feel will be sort of quite different. So hopefully we can give some context to all of this. The first major part of the legislation will be the abolition of ASTs. So that is what is known as an assured short hold tenancy agreement. And that's how every non-contractual tenancy agreement in the rented sector operates at the moment. There are a couple of exceptions to that, but the vast majority of tenancies will be operating under an AST. The change from moving from an AST to what will be known as an assured tenancy, it triggers a couple of things. The most significant of which is that it will remove any fixed term from tenancies that you enter into. So from the off, effectively, the tenancy won't have an end date, which sort of it does remove some certainty for landlords in particular, where they're sort of trying to sort of plan things moving forward. But naturally, there are caveats to that. So there are sort of notice periods that will sort of come in that will be designed to make sure that tenants aren't just moving in for a month and then moving out and sort of making the most of a relatively cheap hotel stay, for example. So there are definitely sort of practical things that are coming through within the legislation that will hopefully alleviate any sort of concerns there. But it is a major change. And there's a couple of sort of indirect impacts from that. Some major ones being that, for example, rent will be unable to be paid in advance by tenants that are moving into properties, because without a fixed end date, it's difficult to manage that in practical terms. The impact there might be whether it's a common practice with international students, for example. So they don't have any references to speak of, and they don't have any sort of history renting in the UK, nor do they have any job history. So they may well just pay a year's rent up front. So there are some things to consider there as it comes to looking at what tenants you take into your properties. There are sort of a couple of things that have been sort of raised amongst the discussions around this, largely on a positive sense, that it may improve the rates of arrears in some areas. And there's quite an interesting thought process in that, without the pressure of sort of a tenant having to reach the end of a 12-month period, as an example, it may well raise those issues that they might be in financial difficulty a bit sooner, and therefore the management of that process might be a little bit simpler and more straightforward. So there are current definitely sort of considerations to be made. One of the things that the biggest concern that people have is that it's going to shorten the amount of time that tenants go into their properties. The reality, as it stands, is that the average tenancy in England and Wales is in excess of 4 years long. So in practical terms, that may not be the case. But of course, it is very important, as always, to sort of look at choosing the right tenants and making sure that that is all in hand. One of the knock-on impact of that is limiting rent increases, not capping them by any means, but limiting them because of the need for a formal service of notice to implement that. So at the moment, the current sort of state of play means that if you have a tenant that's been in your property, say, for a year, as you renew the contract, you might input a rental increase, or there may be something in the contract already that determines that there will be a rental increase down the line. Obviously, without any fixed terms to the tenancy, that's quite difficult to manage. So it already exists, the Section 13 notice, but every tenancy will now be required to serve it in order to increase the rent. Will be introducing a mechanism for tenants to dispute that increase if they feel that it goes over and above what they're determining as a fair market rent. The follow-up question to that is, how is a fair market rent determined? And we'll come through in a couple of other sections as to how that will be. But basically, it's looking at the introduction of a private rented sector database, which will provide an awful lot of data and an ombudsman for landlords, which will be able to determine those sorts of things. The other sort of impact of this may be that it might dampen slightly the rates of increases on rents that we've seen over the last couple of years, which, to be frank, is probably no bad thing. Where in some areas we're seeing rental increases of 20% a year, and that has definitely reduced this year for sure. And hopefully is sort of stabilizing a little bit. But I think most investors with a long-term view would be sort of on the same page about hoping that the market is stable for the long term, and rent increases increase gradually rather than ups and downs and shocks to the market, particularly on that sort of rental front, where hopefully that makes it a little bit more manageable. On that, the process to serve notice to evict a tenant is changing quite significantly. This is one of the sections of the legislation that has received the most media attention, I would suggest, is the removal of Section 21 notice, which in effect is a no-fault eviction notice. So what that means is that you can serve this notice to your tenant after any fixed term of the tenancy has expired, and you can therefore reclaim the property for any reason that you like. A lot of landlords are concerned about the removal of that, sort of noting that it won't give them as much flexibility to manage those tenancies, but also what the impact will be on tenants that go into arrears, and what the impact will be on tenants that are behaving antisocially within the property or breaking the terms of the tenancy agreement, and so on and so forth. So the positive here is that rather than having a slightly sort of grey area as to let's just serve a Section 21 and have the tenants come out, and then sort of move on from there, Section 8 notices, which currently are only used for rental arrears and antisocial behaviour, basically breaking the terms of the tenancy agreement, are being expanded quite significantly. So there will be a raft of prescribed reasons that you can use as a landlord a Section 8 notice to evict a tenant. For those here in the UAE, actually it's probably sort of more familiar to the people here than it would be back at home, in that some of these reasons, for example, are you want to sell the property, you want to move back into the property, you want a family member to move back into the property, so on and so forth, or you need to refurbish it or renovate it. So as professional landlords, there's definitely a wide-ranging sort of scope to utilise that. It may be slightly more impactful on accidental landlords, who might need a slightly higher degree of flexibility as and when they want to use the property. The term accidental landlord is probably not the best, but for example, if you rented your property out as you sort of came over to the UAE, and you might use it in the summer and so on, that might become a little bit more difficult, and it will add sort of a bit more security for tenants. And that is its design, is to give tenants more longevity within the properties that they're renting, and be protected from eviction that they're not expecting. The prevention of bidding wars, again, whilst slightly on the face of it might seem counterproductive to achieving the best rents and making the most of tenants paying effectively to rent your property, whilst it may do that, it also sort of has quite a sort of long, far-reaching positive, I would suggest, in that I don't know if anybody has experienced trying to rent a property in Southwest London in recent years, for example, but it's pretty chaotic. And the reason for that is that there is a shortage of rental property. To Elliot's point earlier, there's a shortage of property in the UK generally, and I know that it's sort of front and centre for the current government's plans is to build 1.5 million homes over the course of the next 5 years. Most people think that is sort of wildly unrealistic based on the current sort of levels of delivery. So it does lead to these situations whereby there's roughly about 25 inquiries property that comes to the market at the moment as a national average, which leads to these intense sort of bidding wars. So some rules and regulations will sort of come in around that, which, as I said, I don't personally think is any bad thing. Effectively, you can mark up your advertised rent at whatever you like, but you won't be able to accept anything above that. So it will discourage people from bidding against each other. Well, in fact, it will sort of prevent it entirely. And from there, it's up down to the landlord to work out what the market rent is, rather than letting an almost sort of auction style process occur. So a couple of key considerations to make, I think, would be that if you currently don't have rent reviews in place and you haven't sort of figured out what the market rent of your property really is, it might be worth looking at that sooner rather than later. And from there, if you're renting property out yourself through various platforms that you can do that, it might be worth just taking some advice from a local letting agent, whatever it may be, to work out what the market rent is, and make sure that you're maximizing that as far as you possibly can, or should be indeed. And similarly, I think it comes down to various things on the front end that you need to be looking at as landlords when you sort of manage these processes, is ensuring that you have some mechanism, whether that be a professional letting agent or somebody that you're sort of relying on to do these things for you, to reference tenants very strongly, make sure that you're getting the background and affordability checks right. And indeed, it's sort of a slightly separate point, but looking at things like their right to rent documents and so on, that make sure that, whilst there's more control coming into the market, you need to have that process in place, to both manage it and effectively navigate it. In that sense, the introduction of a landlord ombudsman is quite an interesting sort of process that we haven't seen before across the UK. To give some context, as it stands, if a dispute arises between a landlord and a tenant, the current process is, and forgive me for being slightly casual, but you argue out amongst each other. If you can't sort of work out what the right thing to do is, you basically take each other to court, and it's a long, drawn out process that is not very helpful for anyone. So the introduction of an ombudsman here, whilst it can seem slightly onerous to landlords, in that I think the landlord ombudsman term slightly suggests that it will be something that landlords have to sort of follow and tenants are sort of getting away with it. Its design in practice will be to formally resolve disputes between landlords and tenants. As mentioned in sort of previous points, with things like market rents being formally noted as to what they can be, and tenants being able to dispute those when landlords are putting rent increases up and above that. It will be the landlord ombudsman that resolves those sorts of things. It will be an impartial system, so that it won't be sort of a weighted system one way or the other. And effectively, you'll be able to, make your case. Tenants and landlords will be able to make their case, and they'll provide a judgment, and everybody sort of needs to stick to that and sort of go from there. Again, a little bit like RPA and other sort of departments here that you might be sort of more familiar with. One of the challenges I would sort of say with this is that there may be some potential for abuse. So, for example, a tenant just simply doesn't like the fact that their rent is being increased, or a landlord wants to serve notice to the tenant, they just don't want to leave. I think there's a risk that tenants could sort of try and sort of drag things out a little bit by taking things up to the ombudsman and asking for resolutions that actually could have been worked out between either party quite amicably. So again, I think it comes back to, for accidental landlords who aren't doing this on a day-to-day basis, make sure that you've got the right tenants in your property. For professional landlords who are building portfolios, make sure that you're buying in the right areas, that you don't have sort of lots of sort of tenant problems. And it's quite interesting, there are sort of hotspots for tenant issues, and if you pick the right areas, actually a lot of this becomes slightly sort of irrelevant, where good landlords and good tenants come together, and as with all of these things, it often becomes unnecessary. Similarly, on that front, the private rented sector database is something that we haven't seen previously. Its aim is to make enforcement easier for landlords that are acting irresponsibly, and similarly to provide the data required to determine what a fair market rent is, and so on. The onus will be on landlords to register. Just a fair word of warning, there will be a big fine if you don't register, and you are found to be renting a property out without a registration certificate, I presume is what will sort of come. But having said that, I think if you are a good landlord and you look after your property and all the usual things that a responsible landlord would do, I don't think there's anything to worry about there. The Decent Home Standard is quite a significant introduction to the legislation, as is the coupling up of that with Awab's law. If you've been out in the UAE for some time, you may not be as familiar with it, but for those that have been back in the UK and in the last sort of 5 years or so, you may well remember that there was a case in Manchester within a social housing property that had awful amounts of mold and damp and so on, which wasn't corrected by the local authority as it should have been. And very sadly, the child that was living in the property ultimately sort of passed away off the back of the impact that the conditions that the property was in had on his health. So this has been sort of put forward and is already in place as legislation, I believe, as it comes to social housing. So that it sort of improved the reporting requirements for local authorities and so on. The Decent Home Standard effectively takes the requirements to keep a home up to standard and just puts the onus back onto private landlords. Again, as a responsible landlord, there's really nothing to be concerned about there. It's very straightforward. It effectively sort of says that you need to provide adequate ventilation for a property, and make sure that there are measures in place to kind of assess its sort of livability, as it were, for want of a better word. That, as I say, for decent landlords, shouldn't be anything to be concerned about. It does, however, feed into the shift within the market towards very good quality energy efficiency properties and those types of properties there, in line with removing the ability to let properties that don't meet certain energy efficiency standards, etc. So certainly something to keep an eye on. But for good landlords, this isn't an issue. A couple of sort of points around the prohibition of discrimination have sort of come through within the legislation. In my mind, slightly oddly, in that these laws pretty much already exist. But again, I think that one of the key sort of goals of this legislation is to formalize and round up everything that is currently in place, but maybe in sort of slightly different disjointed parts all over the place. So again, it's looking at how can they do that. And one of those things that has been sort of quite a significant part of legislation that has been introduced in the last 10 years or so is prohibiting discrimination against anyone really that falls within the sort of key protect. Specifically notes out tenants that are in receipt of benefits, tenants that have pets, and tenants with children. So in practice at the moment, in some parts of the country, you will see an awful lot of advertising it is already prohibited, that would say, sorry, but we don't accept tenants with DSS, as an example. And similarly, it was these adverts might say, sorry, we don't accept tenants with children or pets, or and so on. So on the pets front, obviously this is probably the most straightforward. You will be unable to unreasonably decline a tenant with a pet. But one of the key points to make is that they are sort of quite cognizant of the fact that as a landlord, you need to be able to determine who rents your property or not. So ultimately, you will have complete discretion on this, but it's all around determining what is unreasonable, what is reasonable, and so on. Anybody with a fair amount of common sense would recognize that a German Shepherd would not want to be living in a studio flat, for example. So I think the first part of this is to look at what is practical and what isn't. But from there will be things that you as landlords can take up to ensure that you're protecting yourselves. So there are insurance policies that you can take out, or the tenants can take out rather, that you can enforce that the tenants must hold whilst they've got a pet that is living in the property. And of course, you can take increased deposits to protect against any damages that pets might make. The other parts of that, looking at tenants with benefits and with children, coming back to this, the key point is around your discretion as a landlord is the final part of it. Naturally, if you've got quite an expensive property, you won't be receiving a lot of inquiries from tenants that sort of are currently in receipt of DSS benefits, as an example. And it's really about looking at affordability and suitability. So going back to those sort of reference checks, if you don't have a sort of robust procedure for that, I would suggest that you look at that quite quickly. But we can sort of make sure as landlords that we're not accepting tenants that can't afford to pay the rent, and that is, a fair market rent, free market, and so on. It's crucial there to just make sure that we've got all the information that we need to assess what sort of tenants are suitable for the properties that we have. The reality around that, again, ultimately sort of comes down to you as a landlord, and you have complete discretion to say, I do not feel that this tenant would be suitable for my property because of a number of reasons, and therefore we can sort of look at that. As it comes to children, is a little bit more sort of grey, I would suggest. But there will be common sense approaches to this that make a lot of sense on all fronts. A couple with 2 children, for example, you could reasonably say wouldn't be suitable for a 1-bedroom apartment. So again, it's entirely down to your discretion as a landlord, and how you feel you think that the tenants coming in would suit your property. There are various kind of considerations to make, and I think again, it's sort of worth looking at this to make sure that you've got a full understanding of it. But for good landlords, responsible landlords, I think we can sort of let common sense prevail. And the final sort of point around all of this is an enhanced enforcement sort of system that the legislation will introduce, which effectively will allow local authorities to, I think, particularly in the sort of the immediate introduction of it, just make sure that landlords are doing the things that they're supposed to be doing. And it will introduce some quite severe civil penalties for people that aren't. So as an example, minor sort of discrepancies against some of this legislation that's being introduced will incur a £7,000 fine. And persistent indiscrepancies will come up to sort of £40,000 in some cases. So it's very important to make sure that you're following that legislation. And there are things that we can be doing at this moment in time to just make sure that we're not going to get caught out, whether that be having letting agents have a look at a sort of property health check, as it were, making sure that you've got all of your compliance documentation in place and it's up to date. You've got IDs for your tenants, so on and so forth. But really just looking at, are there any sort of particular things that I need to be doing in the very short term, so that when this legislation is introduced in probably a month or so, I'm not going to get caught out. A lot of this, ultimately sort of sounds a bit worrying. I think the overarching sort of thing that this legislation will do is formalize a lot of the processes that are currently in place, to the point that we just purely out of habit, a lot of the landlords will have a couple of years with one tenant in the property, feel that the rent isn't quite up to where it should be, serve a Section 21 notice and raise the rent that sort of way. It will prevent those sorts of processes, but also sort of balance out so that there is mechanisms that are in place on the other side of it that allow for things like rent increases, the eviction of tenants and so on, that hopefully should create a lot more formality within the market, introduce some good processes, and hopefully give everybody a little bit more certainty. And hopefully that didn't sort of go on for sort of too long. But we welcome any questions about it.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Christian. I think that's a really comprehensive overview of this new legislation. I think from my perspective, and just as the RPA's perspective, and when we're sort of advising clients, I think now more than ever, if you're looking to add real estate to your investment portfolio, whether it or grow your current residential property portfolio, buying the right properties, I think, has become more important than ever. Whether that be, and it is probably erring a lot more towards, say, a new build property or a property that has been recently renovated. That would sort of negate many of the issues that sort of could potentially arise if you bought an older property, and sort of legislation that's put in place to protect the tenants ultimately. The other sort of thing that really does sort of come through from all this legislation, and ultimately this is just making the market a better place, right? This is making the whole process of purchasing real estate, owning real estate as an asset, with more legislation and ultimately giving you more protection. That's where it comes down to. So if you're buying the right properties, and then very importantly with the right managing agent, so you have the right team around you who's going to give you the correct advice, who are going to make sure that your asset is being maintained in the correct way, that you are getting the right advice from a tax perspective, that you have the lending and everything else like that, but also very crucially managing, and the final bit is finding the right tenants. ensuring that the checks have been put in place where there aren't going to be the issues. As Christian says, the average tenancy in the UK is actually 4 years. Now, obviously, that is an ideal scenario if you have a tenant in there for 4 years and they pay their rent on time every month, and that you see that maybe incrementally go up over a 4-year period. It's so important to ensure you're getting the right advice with the right team around you. So right properties, right managing agent, the right tenant will mean that all the sort of legislation and sort of the clickbait, if you like, that's being put out there, which maybe has worried and it has concerned people. We've got ex-colleagues and friends and things like that that are sort of in the UK that are certainly sort of worried and are selling. They are selling up their sort of portfolios and stuff like that, but maybe without really understanding the true meaning. And if you take exactly what will happen, and then if you get the right advice, let's say from Tony, when you're looking at ensuring that you hold the asset in the most tax efficient way, whether that be as a in a limited company, UK limited company, or as an individual, that will ensure that you're covering all bases. That the long-term goal, which ultimately, when you're looking at UK property, is the way you should look at this. It's not a short-term flip. You should be looking at holding it for a 10 to 15-year period to generate income and to see house price growth. As long as you're doing that over a 10, 15-year period and you've got the right advice in place and you're buying the right properties and with the right tenant and the right managing agents, the right tenants, it will be a very favourable, history tells us it's a very favourable investment to make. Okay. Tony, do you have anything to add to that?
Not a great deal more. If you could just flick on one slide, just to give people the opportunity to understand how to get in touch with us, or indeed register for future events or follow us for more information. We're very happy to address any further questions offline. So please do get in touch with either St James's Place partner or with the RPA Group. There is one question that's popped into the chat box, which we'll just finish with if we may. And that is, will enforcement processes be available for landlords against tenants?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. It is slightly skewed, but basically that it comes back to the landlord ombudsman introduction. So that ombudsman will be able to, adjudicate and assess disputes that you have with your tenant. But similarly, it comes back to the prescribed reasons that the Section 8 sort of part of this legislation, the notices that we use to sort of evict tenants, that will sort of enhance and bolster itself to protect landlords a bit further as well. So they're adding in some wording around antisocial behaviour and increasing reducing rather the sort of initial period that a tenant may have sort of stopped paying their rent for before you can sort of take action against that. So at the moment, in the usual way, if you sort of come up against it on that front and you don't get anywhere with serving notice yourself and simply speaking to your tenant and so on, your route is to go to small claims courts and sort of have them enforce any action that needs to be taken. The reality there is that it's quite slow and cumbersome. So what the previous iteration of this legislation had tried to introduce was a singular housing court that actually might sort of improve that process and speed it along a little bit. The most recent version that is coming through to us now has not done that. But as I say, the reality is that small claims court is still available to you, and they have bolstered parts of the existing legislation to help landlords sort of simplify how they go about any action that they need to take with antisocial tenants, tenants that haven't paid their rent, etc.
Brilliant, thank you, Christian. Well, I think now we'll close the session at this point. Well, firstly, massive thank you to you, Elliot and Christian. Elliot, I think you absolutely hit the nail on the head when you said there's a huge need for advice. There's obviously a load of information you've given us today, hugely valuable with loads of considerations. So that advice element is going to be absolutely imperative. Ladies and gentlemen, as I say, do get in touch if you want any further information or if we can answer any additional questions. But on that note, we'll bring it to an end and thank you very much for your attendance.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
very much. Cheers. Thanks, guys. Bye bye.